Welcome to The Forest Garden, a podcast for gardeners who want to upgrade their landscapes into biodiverse food forest systems. On today's episode of The Forest Garden, we have the pleasure of hosting Eric Toensmeier, author of Paradise Lot, Perennial Vegetables, and The Carbon Farming Solution. Eric's work has been an inspiration for hundreds of folks who garden like a forest. Today, tune in to learn about his transition from Paradise Lot to a much larger 5-acre property and some of his more recently published research. Stick with us. Eric, thank you so much for joining us. We feel really, really blessed for you to be here. For our listeners, Eric is one of the reasons that both Ben and myself became interested in edible forest gardens or food forest practices in the first place. Maybe a reason that, one of the things that sort of pushed Ben to pursue a degree in agroforestry, but definitely something for at least me that motivated me to move into a different degree practice away from what I was doing before. So Eric has had an incredible impact on our lives, and many, many, many other people. We're really, really grateful to have him here today. Some of you listeners may be familiar with Paradise Lot in Holyoke, Massachusetts, which was a book that Eric wrote. And we last season interviewed Jonathan Bates, who was Eric's sort of partner in crime at Paradise Lot. Today, we're not going to be talking about Paradise Lot just really intensely. It's something that's been covered quite a bit that you can either buy the book by that name or find online lots of coverage of what exactly went down at Paradise Lot. Eric, to start things off, I guess maybe we could just sort of, you could introduce yourself and talk about the transition that you're going through now, moving away from living in Holyoke and to this new property that I've heard about that sounds really, really exciting.
Sure. Thanks a lot for having me, you guys. Ben has come to courses I've done all over in several countries, and I've had the opportunity to meet up with him in Nashville and all kinds of things. So it's great to be here. And I'll also say that, it's very nice that people appreciate the work I do. What I'll say is the stuff is cool. The food forests and perennial crops are really cool. And I've felt like that since I first, got into this 32 some years ago. And I'm glad that it's somewhat contagious for people. I just think it's really, the plants speak for themselves. I just, put it in words on a piece of paper or something. So you want to know the sort of the story and where we are and how we're transitioning from Paradise Lot to this new thing?
Well, yeah, maybe just to sort of introduce, it's possible that some of our listeners have no idea what Paradise Lot is.
Sure.
Maybe the best thing to do is to start off with what your introduction was initially into all of this, and then sort of segue into the now.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So right after high school, I went to work at a nature center in Philadelphia, and they turned me on to permaculture there. And I basically, what I was interested in about that is the food forest component, or that's kind of all there was really in those early books, in Permaculture 1 anyway. And I just thought that's what I want to do with my life. So that's what I did. After a long period of working on different farms and all that, I started a seed company in the late 90s selling perennial vegetables. And Jonathan Bates, who was on your show before, and I were working on that together. We were renting land, and it just got really clear that planting trees on rented land is sort of a dead end. So we decided to buy a home, a duplex where we could each have one side of the house eventually with our own sweeties, who did not exist at that point to our knowledge, but have a shared backyard where we wanted to show all this at an urban scale in a small, urban lot, which we found one with truly, truly terrible soil. We started in 2004, and it's going very, very strong today, loaded with, fruit trees and berries and perennial vegetables, and a really nice greenhouse with citrus and whatnot inside that survives the winter with no heating because it's super insulated and all that. It's really kind of become a good test for the notion of the forest garden in the cold climate with very high diversity, sort of relatively intensive management. And it was a lot of fun. And while I was there, I worked I managed an urban farm, and I worked for Project Drawdown and wrote this carbon farming book and this Perennial Vegetables book, finished the Edible Forest Gardens book. A lot of was a 17-year process of living there and doing lots and lots of learning. It was a great place to learn things. And eventually we just started to feel a little like a painter whose canvas was very full. It's only 1/10 of an acre. It's pretty darn full. So our new place has about 5 acres, and that's a lot more land to work with. It's a very tiny place in some senses, but it's really more than enough land for us.
Yeah, I can imagine after a while the one persimmon tree and one peach tree and whatever else became sort of monotonous.
It was great. It's great. I like planting new trees, and I didn't have any more room for that. And I wanted big trees, and I couldn't plant any big trees at all. So,
Eric, you said in one of your Facebook posts that, and you might have mentioned it to me last time we spoke, that the new spot that you have also has some pretty rough soil conditions.
Terrible.
Yeah. So as far as like your approach to improving, let's just talk about soil for a moment too, because it all starts there. Did you go through the process of like doing soil samples, or is this something that you're trying to build in a similar way to Paradise Lot? That'd be a lot of sheet mulch, I'm sure, for 5 acres. How are you looking at soil this time around?
Well, our soil here, our soil at Paradise Lot was sort of 3 different really terrible kinds of soil. There was a sandy acid with lead, and a compacted clay with concrete in it, and then a sand and gravel. So this place, they were all urban soils, This place is almost entirely sand and gravel in the soil, and has been farmed real hard for about the last 70 years or so, plowed and plowed and plowed and plowed. So the field, which had been abandoned for a number of years, was really mostly goldenrod with large spaces of bare soil in between, and lots of lichen and moss, and big areas that were only moss, which tells me that it was pretty terrible. It's extremely, it's excessively well drained. It doesn't hold organic matter well. It's compacted, and it's been just really farmed out pretty hard. So we have quite a few years ahead of us. But I want to try different stuff. We did a lot of sheet mulching at the old place, which was great. And I'll probably do some of that here. There's sort of an area around the house, about an acre of lawn around the house to convert to edible landscape, food forest kind of stuff. And then there's a complex of a barn and 4 large greenhouses, 400-foot greenhouses. And then there's a 3-acre field in the back. So we'll be approaching each of those areas really differently. The backfield, I really want to do things that farmers could do. So we're not trucking in organic matter at all. We're growing it all ourselves. So the cover crop is starting to green up very nicely back there. In the front, we may do some sheet mulching, but also some cover cropping and various other things. And we've got chickens and geese going here, so we're starting to build up some stocks of manure and whatnot that I think will be helpful. But I don't think it's all going to be sheet mulch. Yeah, I really would have loved to, given a chance to try again at Paradise Lot, I would have loved to come through with a broad fork, loosen the whole thing up, a heavy duty broad fork, and loosen the whole thing up, and then cover crop it for a year. We never really got to do that there. So here I'll get to try that approach instead.
Man, those greenhouses sound like quite the opportunity. Are there any sort of plans? I mean, personally, I have like an affinity for cold hardy figs, so I would probably fill them with every fig variety I could ever think of. But I know that back at Paradise Lot, there was all sorts of citrus. There was like kumquats and Meyer lemons and some other citrus. And then I even saw a post where you introduced a perennial gecko or lizard that would potentially sort of work for integrated pest management in that sort of context. So I don't know. It seems like this is an entirely new experience of experimental growing that can happen in. It is in the same climate zone, correct? It's about in zone 6.
We're only about 10 minutes away from Paradise Lot. So we're very close. We're just like 100 feet outside of the boundary of Holyoke. So we're very close by. Well, okay, let's see. So we're doing different things with different greenhouses. One of them is now poultry building. 2 of them are getting fixed up for multi-purpose greenhouse. So some of them will be winter vegetables or nursery or whatever from year to year. We're We're renting one to a friend right now. And then there's a larger greenhouse. The widest one will be working to figure out how to insulate it in the same way we did at Paradise Lot so that we can grow things like mangoes and avocados and citrus. So we're aiming for a fully subtropical greenhouse. Maybe by the end of next year. It might be another year after that, but hopefully then. So we'll do some Elliott Coleman style winter vegetable growing this winter. They're full of vegetables this summer. They needed a bunch of work. The end walls were rotted out. The plastic was all torn up. So it's been a year of just fixing them up, kind of getting the infrastructure in order. One of the lessons we learned from Paradise Lot is don't try and do everything at once. So I set achievable goals, ambitious but achievable goals for this year. And we're trying to, each year figure out what we want. When I say we, it's really me and my 10-year-old, right? So trying to figure out what can actually be pulled off and not do everything at once. And another lesson from Paradise Lot is, which we did not do well there, is get the infrastructure right from the beginning. Do what you need to do for fencing, irrigation, buildings, access roads, whatever, from the beginning, which we didn't do very well there. And it was very hard to add those things later once all the trees were in place. We also learned from some successes from Paradise Lot, like we're taking a full year to do the design here. I'm not locking myself. I mean, I knew I was going to plow up the backfield and put a cover crop in, but that's not exactly making final decisions or anything. And we're managing the lawn with geese and we're fixing up the greenhouses, but they're already on the same footprint they were. So we're not locking ourselves into anything just yet over here. We're trying to take some time and see the land in all its seasons.
I mean, you were just saying to, really think through the beginning stages of your design and the advice that you are taking from Paradise Lot. Now, like if we go even before that to finding this piece of property, was it, because I'm sort of thinking about this from the perspective of maybe someone wanting to maybe find a piece of land and homestead and grow their own food or experiment with new crops and plant trees, are either having issues finding the right piece of land or they aren't sure about how to go about that. What was your approach to finding this? Was this a piece of land that or property that you took a lot of time to find, or did it, kind of present itself to you and you took the opportunity?
It took some time. We did clarify our goals and we were looking for, in terms of amount of space, in terms of proximity to our life in Holyoke. We wanted a place that was open rather than already covered with trees. A farm would have been lovely, but we would have been, we would have been okay with just an acre of land with a house on it. But this place presented itself, and after a sort of long and dramatic series of ups and downs, we moved in March. So it does help to really know what you're looking for. So we looked at a lot of other places and we said, well, no, because this, no, because that, if it doesn't meet our list of non-negotiable criteria, we're just not doing it. And I'm so glad we're picky because we ended up with something just right. I mean, the soil is, I'll just say again, really terrible, but that you can fix. You can fix that. You can't fix your proximity to the people you love or whatever. So
Eric, one article that you released potentially 2 years ago now, I guess, maybe last year, that I really, really found super valuable was the nutritional value of perennial crops and even woody trees.
Yeah.
And so I imagine that has to have some influence on the species that you're thinking about planting there, which, not right away, because this doesn't have to happen in a day. But maybe if you could, for our listeners, sort of describe that research, the process of how it was put together and the results. And then if that is making any sort of imprint on you in terms of the tree species that you really want to hone in on.
Sure, of course. So it was a sort of a global, first we wanted to see just how many cultivated perennial vegetables are there out there in the world. And it was somewhere over 600. And we wanted to know how they compared nutritionally with the vegetables you can buy at the store. That was inspired by, there's a book called Leaf for Life from an organization by the same name who do just great stuff around nutrition around the world. And they pointed out that not only is there this set of nutrients that are really lacking in people's diets, what they refer to as traditional malnutrition, but also there's this another set of health related, and there's about 2 billion people affected by traditional malnutrition. Then there's quite a few people, hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, with another set of deficiencies related to the industrial diet, the American diet. So we were really looking at analyzing which vegetables have those particular key nutrients that people are ill or dying because they don't have enough of them in their diet. Figuring of all the nutrients you could look at, those seem like a great place to start. So we tracked down data on over 300 species of vegetables, annual and perennial. We compared them to this set of reference vegetables, we call them, that are the ones you can buy in the store, anywhere around the world. And found that indeed many perennial vegetables are quite outstanding, much higher than the highest levels you can find of those nutrients in any vegetable in the store. And that as a group, not all trees with edible leaves have outstanding nutrition, but as a group, they are the most nutritious vegetables that exist when compared with other classes of vegetables like herbaceous perennials, woody vines, annual vegetables, and so on. And quite a few of them are of outstanding nutrition. So I'm almost done a book on trees with edible leaves that goes into that in some more detail. It was cool to see that we were already growing many of the most nutritious vegetables in the world in our garden, and we didn't know it because we grew a lot of vegetables, a lot of species. So here I'm really very excited to have a large collection of trees with edible leaves and to grow a lot of the individual species that I like the most. So that is a big influence here, I think, in that sense. And certainly I'll be working on why not grow the most nutritious things you can, as long as you think they taste good. I also have a paper coming out any day, actually, with an organization in Vermont, one in Maine, and then a number of different folks in Sweden and Denmark, where we tested the nutritional quality of these same nutrients of, I think, 14 different perennial vegetables for cold climates that had not really been looked at, because mostly what you find when you look is there isn't much out there on a lot of these plants. And that was very much in line with the other paper, in that so many of these perennial vegetables are exceptionally nutritious in so many ways. And very, very much, I would say it's a very powerful argument for growing them, is that they are, not only are they easier to grow and can grow in places where annual vegetables won't grow well, like shade or wet places or what have you, but also they're highly nutritious, which certainly matters. I mean, any vegetable is good. And if you're just eating lettuce and tomatoes, that's great. Go for it. There's nothing wrong with that. And that'll give you a lot of what you need. But if you really want to, pack it in, then these highly, highly nutritious vegetables are the way to go. And it was really fun to do that work with these in 3 countries, but in some cases looking at the same species, and just to really see the international enthusiasm for perennial vegetables. One of the folks that we worked with on it wrote a book on perennial vegetables in Swedish, Nevi Sjöberg. And also she wrote one on forest gardens. She is great. And a number of these folks are just very, very hardcore. Some of them are, a number of the folks involved in the study in each of the countries are starting to look at what does small-scale direct market commercial production of perennial vegetables look like? How are we marketing them? What does it look like to scale up production? And in some ways, the nutrition is almost like a marketing tool for them in order to be able to do that. So it's just fun to be like moving into that next level. Not just, great, there's hundreds of perennial vegetables you can grow in your garden, but one way to select them is which ones are the best for you, which is not just which ones fix nitrogen or are suited to your soil or whatever. We can go a step deeper, which is really, really cool that we can do that now.
And also which ones taste good, I imagine.
Well, right. If they're nutritious and they don't taste good, it doesn't do you much good. If you have to eat them to get the nutrition out of them, it's not absorbed through the skin. And the ones we chose for this study were ones that there was not much data on, but also that were really favorites of the people involved in the study, and in some cases of their customers who they're selling to. So they have to taste good. The one I love the most is Chinese tune, which really does taste like chicken soup. I'm going to plant at least 10 of those trees here because I would just eat that every single day if I could. I really love it a lot. Flavor is very subjective. Different people feel very differently about different flavors, but
I think they taste great. And Ironically, it was also the first plant that Ben ever gifted to me. And
Oh,
we just,
Yeah, we've bonded over tune.
yeah, they're great. People talk a lot about moringa, and moringa is amazing and wonderful and fantastic. But Chinese tune is every bit as nutritious as moringa, and it will grow here in Massachusetts just fine. So I feel like we should be paying more attention to that.
You've led me into the question that I wanted to ask next was, what are some of those standouts? Chinese tune is one. I also know that mulberry leaves are a big thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Personally, my grandfather planted a mulberry, or when he bought the house, the mulberry was already there. It fell over in a windstorm this past year, but it's still pushing out leaves. It probably has a year left, maybe, but it's a Morris alba pendula, the weeping.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yep.
I've been able to, I'll eat those leaves and even feed them to parents and friends, and have been able to completely change people's minds on the edibility of tree leaves with this one cultivar that weirdly does have very salad-like leaves. So yeah, I was wondering, if there are specific other cultivars of mulberry that really are standouts, or from all of this research for our listeners, if there's any maybe 5 plants that you could recommend as like the most nutritious and also the most tasty.
We're still really trying to figure that out with the mulberry. I would say there's a variety that was selected in Florida called edible leaf mulberry by Josh Jameson, who has a great nursery down there. And I've got one of those in a pot here. I'm going to try it out. I'm not sure if it'll survive the winter. Not all mulberries are hardy. There's one, oh boy, there's the one that grows in the far north. I sampled it first in Vermont. It's one that St. Lawrence Nursery used to offer. It's like Northrop, I think, is good. And then really it's Illinois Everbearing isn't bad. The pendula I've heard from a couple people is a good one. But yeah, we just really need to go out there and start sampling and finding the best ones, whether they're wild or cultivated mulberries.
Down in Mexico, I remember we saw some of the tigrinum.
Yeah.
And is that mainly selected for tree fodder for animals, or is that also select for human consumption too?
It's definitely for human consumption too. It did not survive the winter for me here, so it's not quite as on my radar. But yeah, that's a good one that was selected by the folks at Las Cañadas in Mexico. And I'm sure around the world there are different forms people have pulled out for that purpose, but I think it's just awaiting our stepping up. Another one that was not quite as so spectacular nutritionally, but I really like is linden, little leaf linden, which is very much a contrast to Chinese tune in that it has a very, very mild flavor, which can be nice to sort of mix that up a little bit. Not everything has to taste strong. And I should just mention for all of these trees with edible leaves, really the way that I grow them and the way that many people grow them around the world is to prune the whole thing back to about 3 or 4 feet high every winter. Or even if you have a long season, twice in a season, because that makes those long, the resprouting growth stays tender for, here in Massachusetts anyway, 4 or 5 months. Whereas like a linden leaf, let's say just on a tree on the street, you might be able to eat for a week or two before it gets tough. When you coppice them like that or pollard them like that, you really have months and months of tender edible growth. So also you can reach it to harvest, which you cannot on a 70-foot tall tree. So that's the way that I tend to think that these things should be managed. Another one, which is really outstandingly nutritious, is grape leaves. I had always thought you only could really stuff them, like stuffed grape leaves, which people also do with mulberry leaves, by the way. People in Israel will stuff mulberry leaves quite a bit as a vegetable. But grape leaves can also just be used as a vegetable in a stir fry or whatever you're cooking. And they're particularly high in vitamin A. They have the resveratrol, is it, that makes wine good for your heart, is also in the leaves. So I think those are pretty outstanding nutritional vegetable. And the other one I really love is milkweed, which may have some mild toxicity or some stronger toxicity to it. Apparently there's some kind of cardiac compound in there of some kind. But people have been eating it for thousands of years, and I've eaten quite a bit of it without any trouble. There is actually a researcher at University of New Hampshire who's looking at the toxicity and looking at developing it as a new commercial perennial vegetable crop. We eat the shoots in the spring, and then the young leaves, and then the whole sort of broccoli head on it, about 6 or 8 inches of that is outstanding. And then the flowers, and then the young pods. So really a long season. The young shoots have 8 times more vitamin C than oranges in them. So it's you have to cook it. It's an extremely nutritious vegetable, really delicious, just lovely. Sea kale is the broccoli of sea kale is just delicious. One of our partners in the nutrition study, Aaron Guman, and some of his partners here in the States, among other things, did a yield trial and found that you get more sea kale broccoli per acre than asparagus. So it yields well. It tastes delicious. It's not the most standout nutritionally, but it's certainly very nutritious. And it tastes just like broccoli. So it's very easy for people to accept as a new vegetable. It doesn't taste like chicken soup or strongly spicy or anything like that. It's just totally ready for the American palate to go. And my plants are now 22 years old on that, and I'm looking forward to taking some root cuttings I took off of them that are growing out in a pot right now and planting them here and getting another 20 or 30 or 40 years out of them. Just a really absolutely delicious vegetable, really beautiful ornamental, and actually loves sand. They grow it in like in Colorado as a xeriscaping plant for very, very dry landscaping, like next to cactus and yuccas and stuff. So I'm really happy about that one too. That's another favorite.
I'm also a huge champion of sea kale. It's one of my favorite, and there's no bitterness to the it's comparable to like a broccoli rabe for most people, but there's no bitterness at all when you eat it. It's so good. Have you ever experimented with some of the other cranberries like cordifolia?
Yeah, we grew cordifolia for a number of years, and actually it was like 3 or 4 years until it even made a broccoli for us. So it was much slower to come into production than sea kale. And the leaves are hairy, which I do not love. I prefer vegetables that aren't hairy, but the broccolis weren't bad. We were hoping to cross it with sea kale to develop a hybrid sea kale and see if we could get some interesting, bigger broccolis on it and stuff, which we did not succeed in doing. But I've heard from people farther south, like in Philadelphia, that they can't get sea kale to grow, but cordifolia grows extremely well for them. So I think it may be more tolerant of heat and humidity, which is certainly important. But there's a bunch of others that I have not grown, and I think it's a really interesting genus, and I would love to see somebody really take that on as their project and do some breeding and start trying to cross those species together and see if we can get a neo-hybrid super broccoli out of it. It would be amazing.
It's ready for prime time.
Yeah, it really is.
University of Missouri, one of my courses, I met another grad student. Actually, I think it was a PhD candidate who specialized in brassica breeding for food crops. And so he learned about my interests, and he invited me to the brassica lab, which I didn't even know existed until I walked into it. And really interesting. Not just the related species to some of the perennial kales and the walking stick kales and collards, but just some very distant relatives to broccoli that I can't even recall the names of because they're not listed as edible in most of the textbooks and most of the reference books. I think that lab in particular was very interested in transgenomics and making some genetic modifications to either existing brassica crops or taking wild relatives and trying to pull them into the more edible or industrial crop world. So, I still haven't totally decided how I feel about that, but everyone has their own opinions on the transgenomics question. But it is interesting to see that work being done. It might be more closer to rapeseed or Arabidopsis work. I don't know how much of it is being done on, perennializing broccoli relatives or sea kale, but they are making the crosses and they are experimenting. So it'll be interesting to see what happens from that research.
And one of the things I tend to think is that if you don't like what big plant breeders are doing, breed stuff yourself. It's not hard to do. A lot of it's not hard to do. I mean, I have a critique of the system as it works is, largely terrible and not oriented towards the kind of aims that I like to have as a general rule, but also like go out and breed something,
So maybe this is a good moment to sort of touch upon the book that you published a few years ago, the carbon farming solution. A lot of people in New England, where we live, are really reliant on their local Stop and Shop or wherever to provide them food, and they're not totally aware that only maybe 10% of the food that they're eating is grown locally in New England. And the sort of ways that we can address that, in my opinion, is agroforestry systems or silvopasture systems, and some of the things that you talk about in that book. So to someone who doesn't fully understand or maybe has never heard of what agroforestry is, what is it and how can we implement it in our own backyard or in our communities to sort of get the ball moving in a better direction?
Sure. Well, agroforestry is a whole range of a huge palette of different techniques that involve integrating woody plants like trees and shrubs with either crop production or livestock production or both. It's a tradition that goes back thousands of years in many parts of the world. Certainly just about everywhere in the tropics where crop production happens, there's an ancient tradition of agroforestry. There's also quite a lot of history of agroforestry in Europe, in temperate Asia, and here in North America. I'm actually working on a book about that as well right now with a couple of indigenous chefs looking at what did land curation, sort of ecosystem curation and agriculture look like in the eastern United States before colonization, and how much do those practices continue now. And agroforestry was one of them. Was one of those things. So it has deep roots, but it has not been part of U.S. agriculture really at all for quite some time. So it's sort of a new idea to us, even though it's an old practice. And it has a lot of advantages. It's outstanding for erosion control. And as rainfall gets more intense with climate change, erosion control becomes more and more important. It can help to adapt to climate change and intense, crazy weather very nicely in many ways. It has huge benefits for water quality and habitat for wildlife and pollinators and beneficial insects and soil health and on and on and on. And it's interesting in that you have to figure out to match the right tree with the right crop or the right forage or whatever, so that they are working with each other as much as possible, sort of minimizing competition and maximizing cooperation, all of which are things that we've been doing in forest gardens for decades now, which is itself a kind of agroforestry. It's a subset of a kind called multistrata agroforestry. So I didn't even know that it was agroforestry for many years, but learning all these things about how to help plants complement each other, help maximize their helping each other, minimizing their hurting each other. We use those same tools in agroforestry all the time, and people have been using those tools in agroforestry for thousands of years around the world. It's really fascinating, and it has incredibly powerful carbon sequestration, much higher than anything else on a per acre basis. It's a very, very powerful set of tools. We need every bit of that we can get if we are to have any chance of actually avoiding the worst with climate change. So, which there is still time to avoid the worst, a decade or so to do that. So it's time to step up the agroforestry a lot.
And so when it comes to the specific plants in those sort of systems, especially in hardy climates, really what occurs to me that what we need to use is the things that replace GMO corn. And so what is that? And maybe it's Chinese chestnut hybrids that, some people would call chestnuts a corn tree in terms of the production of the nutrients that come into your body. Or should we be looking more to perennial grains like kernza, which has been a long haul of getting it to be something that can rival annual wheat? Or this new perennial survivor sorghum that we're all probably really excited about. I'm interested in exactly what you think the attack plan is there.
Sure. I mean, I don't think there's any one answer, but for any given farm, there might be one best answer. For any given field on a farm, there might be one best answer. I do like the perennial staple crops a lot that provide the carbohydrates and protein and fat that we need most to survive. Well, let me talk about what we're going to do here in our backfield for a minute. We may tell you some of what I'm interested in. So the There'll be rows of trees, which are trees that are high in protein and or fat and or oil. Mostly nut trees, but some grafted honey locust, 4 different grafted honey locust varieties, a bunch of sea berries, which are very high in oil, all different kinds of nut trees. In the alleys between those tree rows, we'll be doing a lot of different things, one of which is growing some perennial grains, which I suspect are highly compatible. Annual grains. I literally just today went to visit a planting in Whately, Massachusetts, of a bunch of different, kind of all the best varieties of perennial wheat and kernza that my friend Piyush Labsitwar, who used to work at the Land Institute, has got going there. So they're all fruiting, right? They're all bearing grain right now. So it's very exciting to see that. And we're excited to get a bunch of those going here between these rows of trees, among many other things we want to do. But also I visited a plot he is establishing at Grow Food Northampton, also here in Massachusetts, where he's testing a bunch of these perennial grains, or will be testing a bunch of these perennial grains intercrop with pawpaws. So I feel like we don't have to choose one or the other. We can do both. For, big parts of the Midwestern grain belt or whatever, perennial grains are going to be great. And the ones that are out, which are still, of not yielding as much as we would like them to. If most of the field is in that, and then you have some trees around the edges, like your riparian buffers and windbreaks and maybe some contour plantings in there and stuff for erosion control, that's wonderful. But if the tree component itself is also producing staple food, so much the better, I think. So we're working on that here. But also, honestly, the world needs to, if I remember right, we need to just about double vegetable and fruit production in order for people to get enough of those nutrients that we are lacking around the world, including here. So it wouldn't be bad if we planted a lot more fruits and vegetables as well, perennial fruits and vegetables too. And in some ways, in highly dense areas, highly populated areas, fruits and vegetables make good sense because they don't necessarily ship that well or have a really good shelf life. So doing those close to the market can make some sense, whereas perennial grains or nuts or whatever could and are, I guess, grown, far away and can be shipped here because they have a better shelf life. So Piyush and I are very excited talking about what the prospects would be for doing that kind of stuff here, this combination of perennial grains. What's nice is that our cool season perennial grains like perennial wheat and kernza are mostly active in the cool season. So they'll green up in the fall. They'll often be green through much of the winter and put on a lot of growth in spring before the trees leaf out. Ben's master's work was on this, I know. So if you can match a deciduous tree, especially one that's late to leaf out and early to drop its leaves like pawpaw or black walnut with a perennial grain, and in theory, you have a pretty good match. They're in the same place, but they're not competing for light so much for most of the year, which is something we do in forest gardens all the time. Like we'll grow, ramps or toothwort or other kind of spring ephemeral plants under fruit trees, and they leaf out when they still have sun, really, even though they're in a shady place. By the time it's shady, they may have dropped their leaves already. So that same principle is very much applied in different agroforestry systems around the world. It's been interesting to see actually how much the dynamics in large scale agroforestry are very much the same as what we look at in forest gardens. The difference being the addition of the tractor and having to make things work for the heavy equipment, which has a lot to do with spacing and things like that. Now, and also when you have the annuals in there more, there's more concern about erosion and things like that to think about. But it's largely very similar, just a really scaled up version of what those of us who do, this is a forest garden podcast, so those of us who do forest gardens are dealing with a lot of the same dynamics, I think, day in and day out, year in and year out, season to season, that a larger agroforestry farm does have to deal with.
Yeah, that was a great answer. I have a question about how the transition works, but Ben, I feel like I've been talking this whole time. Do you have any questions you want to pose?
Oh, this discussion has been great. I think we're really providing a lot of value to people who may or may not be familiar with agroforestry or some of this restoration work and perennial vegetables too. Just before we leave the agroforestry for a moment, I was recently looking into, this was a study by the Nature Conservancy that looked across North America for reforestation potential and for carbon capture potential.
Sure. Yeah.
And I was pleased to find that they identified pasture lands in general as having the most restoration potential, both in terms of land area and carbon capture potential. And that's either actively grazed land or challenging grazed land or challenging pasture land, suggesting that we could incorporate trees onto these pastures, both shading the animals, improving their quality of life, but also sequestering carbon, potentially producing a crop if that's the type of the system that is designed. So I see there's a lot of potential there. And one question that I wanted to pose to you, Eric, is, to me, I don't know too many ranchers or people who own cow pasture farms or raise animals. To me, it seems like there'd be fairly low barriers to that approach to increasing the amount of agroforestry, not only in the US, but Canada, Mexico, really all over the world. And to me, it seems like the one agroforestry approach that has the least amount of complexity. We talked a lot about the competition issue or the mechanization issue of alley cropping, but I feel like in terms of rapid, large-scale implementation, silvopasture has the most potential, and the TNC study identified that too. But do you see any issues with that, or issues that farmers or ranchers or people who are raising livestock would have with increasing the amount of tree cover on their land, if it can be shown that it's not going to dramatically impact their pasture production or hay production, or it could actually increase their animal weight and increase the amount of dairy production that they're having? Almost sounds too good to be true, right? There's got to be some not only biological or environmental issues, but maybe just some logistical issues, or cultural issues that would prevent us from expanding in that direction.
I think people have mostly been ripping trees out of pastures for a century or so here. But yes, I think it has huge potential. I think one of the challenges is figuring out how to protect the young trees from being eaten or stepped on or rubbed too hard by the livestock when they're young. So there's different kinds of fencing and tree tubes and other things people are using to make that happen. I'm working on a book on tree fodder for livestock right now, growing trees to feed their leaves to livestock, which is widely practiced in many parts of the world, but not so much here. And I was really surprised to learn that the USDA, the NRCS, actually encourages ranchers to seed a number of different, mostly shrubs, in dry rangeland for them to provide food for the livestock, which I did not know. So saltbush, winter fat, sometimes sagebrush, antelope bitterbrush. Mostly these are things that are evergreen that provide good forage in the winter for livestock, and that come up out of the snow and provide leaves for livestock to consume during the winter, which they need to eat all year. So that is an example that has been, quietly encouraging people to do this for quite a few years. I'm trying to line up an interview with somebody over there about that right now. So in some ways that's already been happening, and I just didn't know about it. I do think the prospects for that. The trick is that establishing those trees costs money. So we do have lots of USDA programs that pay for tree planting, whether specifically through silvopasture or just more generally, which can be done in pastures. The other challenge often is that farmers that sometimes hay and sometimes graze the same field, you have to have the width between the rows of trees, lined up with your hay equipment and all of that. But I think it is something that we could really see take off. I would like to really see take off.
Me too.
Ben, you basically touched upon what my question was going to be, was just, I spend a lot of time thinking about how the transition will actually take place in terms of if we can convince, there's so many different factors and so many different things that stand in the way of this working, but let's say that in a perfect world, we can convince thousands of farmers to transition their GMO corn, or not even just, organic, annually tilled land throughout the Midwest or throughout America, to transitioning over to chestnut trees or to, alley rows, any, or silvopasture, any of these sort of tactics that could put us more in the right direction, what are the first steps that we need to take is something that I think about, because if we're going to be planting trees, it takes a while for them to maybe bear to replace, the grains that they're producing right now. And in that period, will there just be an incredible food shortage that totally sends us down the wrong path? Like, how does that transition work? What are the sort of, for a farmer who has 10 acres of land or whatever and wants to make this transition, but wants to also continue to make a profit, because if there's no profit and suddenly their business fails, then they can't make the change anymore if they're not, profit is definitely a part of it for them. So, I'm just wondering what that sort of introductory transition looks like.
Sure. I'll try and give a couple brief answers to that. One is, you can plant the trees in rows in your crop fields that you already have, and they'll only take up about, the strips that they're grown in will only take up about 6% of the field. So you're not sacrificing a lot of yield initially in order to do that. And if you space them right, you can continue to have good yields of many, but not all crops for the life of the trees, as long as they're not planted too densely. So again, that's sort of like we don't have to choose one or the other necessarily. Another answer is USDA does pay people to implement these practices, so there can be some money to pay you to do it, which helps make it possible. But what I've mostly found, outside of, let's say, the occasional highly innovative farmer who really wants to do this, and there are a lot of, I would say we're sort of where grass-fed was like 20 years ago and where organic was 30 or 40 years ago, in that all the new farmers that I see who are coming in right now are excited about agroforestry. I think it's just the next wave of innovative farmers is what they want to do. That might be my twisted, biased perspective here, but I'm seeing a wave which I've never seen before in the United States of people wanting to do agroforestry. I think for the average farmer, we don't start by planting trees in their field. We start with cover crops and nutrient management. And then we look at some trees around the edge of the farm, like riparian buffers and windbreaks and whatnot. And maybe then we look at some targeting where some erosion control is needed with some trees for that. Or maybe there's a field that's really marginal, not growing crops well, that might go into some kind of a tree crop. And maybe only at that stage are they really ready to start, putting rows of trees right in the middle of their crop field. So it may be a step-by-step process for some people. That's an approach that's worked well in parts of Africa, for example. But it's great if people want to dive right in. I'm all for it, and there are a few people who are doing that. But I suspect we're more going to see that stepwise progress happening for a lot of people.
I couldn't agree more. I feel like, that's really how things need to change. Ben, I want to hand the microphone over to you. I feel like I've been monopolizing this interview.
Eric, it sounds like you're doing a lot of writing these days. Maybe there's some of the research that you've been working on for your books or your writing, or even on top of that, in all of your free time, of course. Are there any interesting fruits or vegetables or trees that you've recently found out about this year that you're keen to learn more about?
Yeah, one of the things I'm really excited about being able to having room to grow here is hardy soap nuts. Soap nuts are, the genus is Sapindus. Mostly the commercial ones are Sapindus saponaria, which is tropical, but there's a subspecies, Sapindus saponaria drummondii, which grows all the way into Colorado. And I've seen it growing at the Denver Botanic Garden and producing really well there. They make a fruit that you cannot eat, but it is soap already. So if you want to do laundry with it, you take a handful of soap nuts, and you can buy them online and stuff. You take a handful of soap nuts and you put them in a sock, and you tie a knot in the sock and put that in, and that's your detergent. And it washes your laundry right off the tree. You don't have to do anything to it. So I really want to get a couple of those going over here and see if I can get them to grow here, because I think that would be a fun product to sell, and I think people would be interested in it. And it's a great example of an industrial crop that is replacing a sort of chemical product in the easiest possible way that requires little or no processing which is, I mean, you can make plastic from plants and all kinds of cool stuff, but there's nothing easier than just putting it in a sock and putting it in your washing machine. That seems pretty great to me. So that's one I'm really, really excited to get going here.
I didn't know that there was a hardy version. I've heard of the soap nut before. I knew it had some relatives that may or may not have been hardy. I didn't quite catch the Latin names. I can look them up later, but I know horse chestnut is related to the soap nut, or at least in the same family. I wonder if you can use that for the same purpose, or if it's only that specific genus.
I think you have to do more. It does have saponins in it, but I think you have to do more to that before you can use it for soap. Whereas this one, you can really just directly use it for soap, which is pretty cool. I think it's pretty neat.
The most natural soap you can get.
Yeah, what's not to love about that? And people are already selling them commercially, so it's just a different subspecies of something that already has a market.
That's fascinating. Okay, well, Eric, you've been very generous with your time. Is there anything else that you'd like our listeners to know about your work, or a place where they can stay updated on things that you're working on?
Sure. I mean, I haven't been a very good blogger lately, but I am at perennialsolutions.org. And actually, I have a Patreon where some people are helping to support the writing, which is very nice. I'm doing these 2 books for Interlace Commons in Vermont, and one is on alley cropping and one is on tree fodder. So people can stay tuned over there for those as they come along.
Well, Eric, thank you so much for joining us. We feel very, very lucky to have you. And if anyone wants to further check out some of the books that Eric has published in the past, Perennial Vegetables, The Carbon Farming Solution, or Edible Forest Gardens with Dave Jacke, all great books to check out. Eric, thank you so much for joining us. And we felt really lucky to have you.
Happy to come back anytime.